We open tonight with alarming developments from behind the heavily guarded walls of Windsor Castle, where a ruthless bid for ultimate influence has struck at the core of the British monarchy. In the shadowed chambers where royal secrecy is guarded with paranoid vigilance, a quiet declaration of war has just been delivered. King Charles III, having endured years of public turmoil, private betrayals, and devastating family ruptures, now faces a crisis far darker than any previous scandal. The demand did not arrive as a polite request for family reconciliation. It came as a cold, aggressive legal ultimatum, drafted by attorneys acting on behalf of Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. She demanded immediate, supervised access to the most sacred sanctuary in the realm, Queen Elizabeth II's sealed private vault beneath Windsor Castle. Inside the king's private study, the atmosphere turned cold and suffocating. Heavy drapes swallowed the morning light, leaving the room illuminated only by the dim glow of desk lamps. Charles sat motionless at his heavy desk, his trembling hands pressing the document flat against the wood as his eyes scanned the text. Beside him, Queen Camilla watched in silent apprehension, noting the precise moment the monarch's restraint shattered. It was not merely anger that gripped the king, it was deep, agonizing grief. This vault was not an ordinary storage room for state treasures. It was an impenetrable sanctuary holding the late queen's most intimate personal letters, unreleased audio recordings, and private heirlooms, possessions never intended for public eyes and never meant to be transformed into tactical weapons in an ongoing war. The letter, delivered through Meghan's legal representative, insisted that personal items belonging to Harry, Archie, and Lilibet were stored behind those sealed steel doors. The Royal Collection Trust held no jurisdiction over this room. Its contents were kept apart because the late Queen considered them holy and confidential. Charles read the final, menacing paragraph twice. The wording carried a sharp threat. Any refusal by the palace would be framed as a deliberate attempt by the Crown to suppress evidence, conceal inheritances, and erase the Sussex family from royal history. To Charles, this was an unspeakable accusation aimed directly at his mother's sacred memory. Pushing his chair back, the king stood and walked toward the window, his silhouette dark against the overcast sky. Camilla moved quietly behind him, understanding that beneath his fury lay the raw wound of a grieving son. When Charles turned back, his voice dropped to a tense whisper, asking how Meghan could know what was hidden inside the vault. Attached to the demand was an inventory listing 3 secret items: a sealed letter addressed directly to Harry, a sapphire keepsake, and an audio recording from the monarch's final year. Only an extremely tiny inner circle knew that list existed. Charles stared at the document in chilling silence as the terrifying reality set in. The threat was no longer outside the palace walls. The list had been leaked from inside. Charles acted immediately, ordering the vault locked under a strict security protocol and demanding the unmasking of the traitor. Yet this demand was merely the spark igniting a far greater battle. Behind those locked doors stood 4 key figures, each carrying deep wounds and believing the chamber contained something that could alter the balance of power. For Charles, protecting the vault was a solemn duty to his mother's memory, a sacred trust he refused to surrender under legal extortion. For Meghan, viewing the palace as a calculating machine that dictated history, the locked door represented proof of an ongoing attempt to isolate her family from royal legacy. For Prince Harry, sitting alone in California as he read the briefing, a wave of hope and shame washed over him upon learning of the sealed letter bearing his name, knowing that seeking it meant triggering another devastating war with his father. And for Prince William, standing motionless beside the fireplace with Catherine, the revelation sparked cold alarm. He knew that any private recording or letter, stripped of context and leaked to the press, could shatter the future of the crown itself. The sapphire shifted everything, turning a family tragedy into a sinister calculation of statecraft. When Prince William examined the leaked inventory in his private study, his eyes locked onto a distinct cataloging phrase, a rare nomenclature used exclusively by Queen Elizabeth II's personal household. The leak had not come from an external source or an aggressive media outlet. It originated from someone who had once stood at the absolute heart of royal life, a trusted figure sworn to eternal discretion. The family struggled to comprehend how Meghan knew what lay beyond the vault's steel doors, until the trail led back to the precise moment the first secret escaped. A shadowed afternoon months earlier, during a private memorial gathering at Windsor Castle. In a quiet corridor far from official guests, a former royal aide had approached Prince Harry. The room was never supposed to carry secrets beyond its stone walls, yet the aide, weighed down by unspoken loyalties, lowered his voice. "Your grandmother left something unfinished for you," he whispered. When Harry demanded clarity, the man spoke of a sealed letter, a sapphire keepsake, and an audio recording held under personal restriction, a legal term signifying that items could not be released without explicit royal permission. Harry left the conversation visibly shaken, pursuing the aide down a silent hallway to ask if his father knew. The aide refused to answer, but deep regret crossed his face. He had revealed enough to reignite a desperate hope in Harry, while withholding enough to leave him tortured by uncertainty. When Harry recounted the conversation to Meghan, she did not hear a warning. She heard undeniable confirmation. In her eyes, the palace was suppressing a rightful inheritance, deciding which family members deserved access to the late monarch's final intentions. Weeks later, an anonymous parcel arrived containing a partial inventory of the vault. Beside the final entry was an ominous handwritten notation, "Release only with sovereign approval." To Meghan, this was proof of deliberate cruelty by King Charles. But when Prince William placed the leaked page alongside the original palace document, he discovered something far more treacherous. The handwritten directive had been forged and inserted after the official inventory was completed. Someone within the system was deliberately driving the royal family toward catastrophic war. Realizing that written statements could no longer contain the escalating crisis, King Charles made a drastic decision. The time for formal correspondence was over. A direct confrontation was now unavoidable. He summoned Harry to a high-security meeting at Clarence House. Aides and courtiers were sternly ordered to vacate the wing. The atmosphere was thick with decades of unspoken grievances. Charles took his seat carrying Meghan's legal demand, his face lined with exhaustion. Harry arrived carrying years of built-up resentment, his stance defensive and rigid. William took his place between them, acting not as a compassionate mediator, but as the future king, resolute in his duty to prevent private history from being dragged into a public war. Moments later, a secure screen illuminated, and Meghan appeared via encrypted video link, her posture calm, composed, and utterly uncompromising. Charles opened the proceedings by laying down 3 non-negotiable conditions. The vault would remain sealed, no inventory would leave royal custody, and no item belonging to the late Queen would be inspected under legal threat. Meghan did not retreat an inch. Speaking with razor-sharp precision, she argued that Archie and Lilibet had a fundamental right to know if their great-grandmother had left them personal legacies. Her tone was measured, but her words struck with deadly force, accusing the king of using privacy as a weapon to erase her children from royal memory. Charles stiffened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. He insisted that protection was not erasure, but as Meghan continued to push, the king's formidable composure shattered into raw, trembling fury. Then, Prince Harry leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Is there a letter with my name on it?" he asked. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Charles paused, unable to answer immediately. That agonizing pause spoke louder than any verbal confirmation. A painful shift crossed Harry's face as years of grief and suspicion coalesced into bitter certainty. Before William could intervene, Charles leaned over the desk, his eyes locked on his younger son. "Grief does not give any of us the right to break her final wishes," the king stated in a low, authoritative voice. Meghan then projected the leaked document onto the screen, pointing to the handwritten instruction beside the recording. But as Charles studied the script, his sharp eye caught a crucial anomaly. The handwriting did not belong to the royal archivist, nor to the former private secretary. Someone else had added it. Harry then revealed that the anonymous source had promised a second page, one proving the Queen intended the letter to reach him after a period of genuine reconciliation. The word reconciliation hung in the suffocating palace air like an unexploded munition. It exposed a profound, devastating truth. The late Queen had not left a weapon of institutional destruction, but a delicate, heartbreaking test of familial trust. As King Charles abruptly terminated the encrypted video link, severing Meghan's distant presence from the room, a far deeper security crisis exploded from Windsor Castle. An urgent briefing was thrust into the monarch's hands, destroying any remaining illusion of palace control. 3 nights before Meghan's aggressive legal demand was served, the outer security grid of the Queen's private sanctuary had been breached at precisely 11:43 p.m. When security officers entered the chamber under emergency protocol, they discovered an archival case shifted from its sealed orientation. The outer container protecting Prince Harry's letter had been opened, photographed, and meticulously resecured. The digital entry card belonged to the trusted Windsor custodian, a veteran employee who broke down during relentless interrogation, swearing he had never set foot near the vault that night. Forensic audit logs quickly unraveled the horrifying reality. His physical keycard had been surreptitiously copied and stolen during the chaotic memorial gathering months earlier. Surveillance records pinpointed the culprit moving through the shadowed corridors. The former royal private secretary himself, the very courtier who had first whispered the secret to Harry in the halls of Windsor. Dragged before the king in a private holding room, the former aide stood broken, his composure collapsing as he confessed to photographing the inventory. He insisted he acted out of a twisted sense of loyalty, convinced that Charles's paranoia would cause him to lock away the late Queen's personal intentions for all eternity. With the traitor unmasked and the palace conspiracy exposed, the atmosphere inside Clarence House shifted violently from a cold legal standoff to a profound human tragedy. King Charles issued an absolute directive. Every courtier, lawyer, and security officer was banished from the floor. For the first time in years, the reigning monarch and his estranged younger son stood alone, face to face without artificial buffers, media advisors, or legal mouthpieces. Resting upon the heavy mahogany desk between them was the physical object that had brought the crown to the brink of catastrophe, a thick, crested envelope secured by a heavy red wax seal bearing Queen Elizabeth II's personal cipher. An agonizing silence enveloped the room, heavy with the oppressive weight of public betrayals, sensationalized interviews, and deep psychological wounds. Charles stared at the envelope, his eyes reflecting a painful conflict between sovereign duty and paternal grief. "Did you come here for this letter, Harry?" the king asked, his voice low, raspy, and stripped of all royal grandeur. "Or did you come to secure another tactical victory over this family?" The question hit with devastating emotional weight. Harry stood motionless, his hands clenched into tight fists, fighting back years of accumulated bitterness. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked with raw, unvarnished grief. "I came because I cannot bear the thought that my grandmother spoke to me one last time, and I was forbidden from hearing her voice." That stark, vulnerable confession tore through the king's hardened defense. Charles looked at his son and saw not an adversary weaponizing the media, but a heartbroken grandson desperate for a final connection to the matriarch who had loved him unconditionally. Harry stepped forward, offering a solemn, unyielding pledge. If given the letter, its contents would remain buried in absolute silence. No excerpt would ever be published, no television interview would ever reference its words, and Meghan would never gain access to the private vault. In response, Charles summoned the former aide one last time to surrender the missing instruction sheet attached to the bequest. Placing his glasses on, the king read his late mother's handwritten instructions twice. The condition for releasing the sealed letter was astonishingly simple. It mandated that the sovereign and his grandson meet privately, without advisors, lawyers, or audiences, to speak in absolute honesty. By confronting one another in that room, father and son had already fulfilled the Queen's final command. She had foreseen the entire tragedy. She knew that royal pride and Harry's reactive pain would erect an impassable wall, and she had constructed a masterwork of emotional statecraft to force them to break it down together. With hands trembling under the weight of the moment, King Charles took a silver seal breaker, carefully sliced through the red wax, and slid the unopened letter across the desk. "She wanted you to have it now," Charles whispered, his voice caught between sorrow and profound relief. Harry reached out and clutched the parchment, his eyes glistening with tears. The balance of power had shifted forever. not through legal coercion or public outrage, but through the quiet, overwhelming triumph of shared grief over institutional fear. By sunrise, the private war had spilled onto the global stage. Headlines across Britain and around the world erupted with sensational reports of the high-stakes palace standoff. Windsor Castle's massive iron gates featured prominently on front pages under stark typography. The vault stays shut. King Charles authorized a brief, immaculate statement from Buckingham Palace, confirming that access to Queen Elizabeth II's private vault had been formally denied, while a personal bequest had been honored strictly according to the late monarch's written instructions. The Crown maintained total ambiguity, refusing to disclose the contents of the letter or name its recipient. But the institutional message was unmistakable. The palace had drawn an insurmountable boundary against external legal force. Outside the King Henry VIII gate, crowds gathered under cold skies, reflecting the sharp divide gripping the nation. Supporters carried portraits of the late Queen, praising Charles for defending her sacred memory against ruthless exploitation, while critics argued that no monarch should withhold personal history from family members. Yet, as media commentators debated the ethics of royal secrecy, the reality inside the institution was absolute. The palace had successfully neutralized the threat, transforming what was intended as a legal ambush into a historic affirmation of sovereign authority. For Meghan, the aftermath brought a cold, devastating realization of her total strategic defeat. Cast publicly as an intruder whose legal offensive had been firmly repelled, she was left completely isolated from the narrative. Though her aggressive maneuvering had forced the palace to address the letter, the resulting settlement excluded her entirely. She had sought to break open the monarchy's inner sanctuary and establish a legal precedent over royal heritage. Instead, she had triggered the immediate creation of an airtight, binding decree. King Charles signed a permanent protocol establishing that no spouse, attorney, publisher, or outside representative would ever be permitted entry into Queen Elizabeth II's private vault. Her power play had backfired, cementing her permanent exclusion from the guarded memory of the crown. Prince Harry returned to California changed, carrying his grandmother's words in total silence. Despite overwhelming media pressure and lucrative media opportunities to reveal the letter's contents, he refused to utter a single sentence, honoring the solemn vow he made to his father. He had chosen quiet reconciliation over public warfare, realizing at last that turning personal pain into a public spectacle would only destroy what remained of his bond with his heritage. Meanwhile, Prince William stood alongside the king, his vision for the future of the monarchy validated. The sapphire keepsake remained safely inside the vault, designated for a future family trust to benefit all of the late Queen's great-grandchildren equally, rather than becoming a trophy for any single branch. The disgraced former private secretary formally resigned, taking full responsibility for the security breach and slipping into obscurity. The storm had passed, leaving behind a new reality defined by fatalistic acceptance and the heavy burden of ancient duty. In the end, the iron doors of Windsor Castle remained sealed, a solemn testament that the British monarchy endures not through surrender, but through unyielding preservation of its sacred boundary. The power shift was absolute. The crown had defended its dignity, a son had received his grandmother's final act of love, and those who sought to force open the doors of power were left standing outside the locked gates of history. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.